Howdy, Dr. Shepard. My name is Luke Shelton, and I am presenting on the influence of the environment on Apis mellifera's preference towards native versus invasive flora. Specifically, I want to know if there are trends across climates that make honeybees prefer native or invasive species more overall. I'll use 5 peer-reviewed sources to explore this topic. Now, some background information. From the Mirandin and Kremen study, which is one of the 5 I used, we know that native and invasive species can have different pollen profiles. This refers to the composition and diversity of pollen types for a plant. Additionally, various environmental factors can cause behavioral and morphological changes in bees, such as bees in environments with tubular native plants having longer tongues to reach the nectar. Climate can also affect the bee's behavior. Bees in colder climates have a narrower foraging window, and bees in wet climates may build sheltered nests to avoid rain. But why do we care if birds prefer native or invasive flora? Well, it can help beekeepers optimize their bees' habitats, and it can also help bees pollinate more and more efficiently. This brings us to our question. Do bees' environments play a role in affecting their preference for native versus invasive floral species? We know that there are differences in honeybee behavior across seasons and in different climates. For example, bees barely forage in the winter, as opposed to their season being in spring and summer. But how do these conditions impact their preference for native versus invasive species? Well, in the study by Wood and his colleagues, who performed their study in various southern Michigan apiaries, they found that while bees much prefer native species in the spring, they vastly switch towards non-native species in the summer. This is best shown in Figure 2. You can see that the percentage of pollen collected from non-native species dwarfs that of the native species later in the year. You can also see this in Figure 1, which shows the increasing and decreasing pollination amounts corresponding to the seasons. Similar results were found in the Vuller study. This implies that bees rely on non-native plants to supply them with their pollen towards the latter part of the summer, when native species may stop flowering. The Mirandin and Kremen study, conducted in California, reveals that both wild and managed bees prefer the native plant species, particularly in mature habitats, as seen in Figure 3. Mature means habitats that have been established for at least 10 years. Additionally, their floral diversity was greater with native plants as opposed to invasive ones. However, the Hung study in Southern California found that Apis mellifera, as an introduced species themselves, could be throwing off the relationship between local pollinators and native plants, and thus the balance between native and invasive plants. It also suggests that dominance and abundance are the biggest factors for honeybee pollination preferences, since bees focus on dominant invasive species in specific areas. Honeybees, as opportunistic foragers, simply go to where the most pollen is. Since exotic plants can flower at different times of the year than native plants, seasonal shifts can change where bees go to pollinate. In the Zanetto study, they observed that rather than having an innate preference for native or invasive species, honeybees prefer the most abundant resources available. Figure 4 shows how exotic species can be more abundant later in the year than native species. Accounting for the difference in flower availability between the two, however, the bees did not appear to prefer native or invasive plants innately. Interestingly, the Urbanovics team found that managed bees more readily visit invasive species compared to wild bees. So, in conclusion, there's not necessarily a direct relationship between a honeybee's environment and its preference for native versus invasive species. However, they do appear to be related through climate, as shown in the Wood and Zeta studies. Differences between when bees or native species flower and when exotic species flower cause bees to favor the exotic species later in the year when the native species stopped or slowed flowering. This relationship may be exacerbated in colder climates, as the Michigan bees in the Wood study and the Paris bees in the Zanetto study showed a stronger preference across seasons than the California bees. So, the answer to our question is yes, honeybees' environments do play a role in affecting their preference for our native versus invasive species. And here are my sources. Thank you for watching the presentation, and thank you for teaching the class.